So if you ask someone from the American Midwest if they have an accent, they will, almost certainly tell you no.
Oh, yeah, definitely not.
Right. To them, they just speak, normal English. The accent is what someone from Boston has or someone from Texas.
Exactly.
And it's this very common cognitive blind spot where your own personal experience just feels like the neutral, invisible baseline. And everyone else is just, well, a deviation from that baseline.
Right, the default.
Yeah, the default. So today we are examining a much deeper, vastly more consequential version of that exact blind spot. Welcome to another deep dive.
We have a really dense, challenging, and honestly, incredibly rewarding stack of source material today for you.
We really do.
Yeah.
We're unpacking the personal notes of John Novick Jr., and these notes form a core part of his ongoing audio series, which is called America, actually.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that these notes give us this remarkable window into a really complex conversation because, well, they operate on two different timelines.
Two timelines, yeah.
Right, so the original notes were actually taken during a 3-day workshop Novick attended back in 2018. This was in Washington, D.C., at Georgetown Day School.
Okay.
And the workshop was titled Power, Practice, and Privilege, Unpacking Our White Selves. And it was, quite intentionally, designed as an all-white space to kind of force a very specific kind of self-reflection.
And this is the important part, what we are actually analyzing today are Novick's reflections on those notes right now in 2026.
Exactly. He's looking back at those notes.
Yeah, he's looking back and realizing that the debates, the profound discomfort, the underlying mechanisms of race, they haven't faded at all. If anything, the social dynamics he documented then are just operating in overdrive today.
They really are. But before we get into the actual mechanics of those social dynamics, we do need to pause for a second and share a pretty crucial impartiality disclaimer with you.
Yeah, this is important. So in his 2026 reflections on why these issues are still so volatile, Novick includes some highly politically charged commentary.
Very short.
Specifically, he asserts that we are currently living in what he calls the age of Trump. And he claims that Trump actively uses demagoguery and vows with bitterness to destroy efforts to create a more inclusive America.
Right, and we must explicitly and impartially state to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing these viewpoints.
No, not at all.
We aren't taking any political side whatsoever here. Our mandate for this deep dive is strictly to convey the ideas exactly as they appear in Novick's original source material.
Yeah, we are just reporting on his stated views so that you have the full context of his mindset and really the framework he's using to interpret his own 2018 workshop notes.
Exactly. We were entirely focused on the underlying ideas.
And the mission for this deep dive is to explore the architecture of racial privilege, to uncover the surprisingly recent historical invention of whiteness, and to really look at the psychological mechanisms that prevent us from building healthier communities.
Big mission.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this. The notes argue that to dismantle a system of bias, you first have to understand how people physically and emotionally approach the topic of race.
Right, you have to look at the entry points.
Yeah, and Novick introduces this engagement spectrum from the workshop, and it categorizes people into 3 distinct modes. You've got toe dippers, waders, and plungers.
And this is such a vital framework because it recognizes that when you introduce a topic tied to identity or historical harm, well, people's nervous systems react in wildly different ways. You just can't expect a uniform response.
Right, so think about it like arriving at a swimming pool.
Okay.
You have your toe dippers. They are sitting on the edge, keeping their center of gravity entirely on dry land. They're cautious, heavily guarded, terrified of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But they are at least probing the temperature.
Right, they're showing up, but safely.
Exactly. Then you have the waders. They're in the water, but they deliberately stay in the shallow end where their feet can touch the bottom.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they are engaging, but they are prioritizing their own comfort, which the notes suggest means they often avoid the deeper, more transformative friction.
Yeah, they don't want to go underwater.
Right. And then finally, you have the plungers. These are the people who just bypass the stairs, run to the deep end, and leap.
Just go for it.
They might belly flop, they might cause collateral damage and splash everybody around them, but they seize the moment and force an immediate reaction. And the notes argue that a healthy community actually requires the flexibility to be all 3, depending on the context.
But see, here's where we have to look at the underlying mechanism of that pool analogy. What's fascinating here is that the notes point out a profound, often overlooked reality. The act of plunging headfirst into these conversations is, in itself, a form of privilege.
Wait, how so?
Well, the workshop introduces this brilliant extension of the metaphor. They point out that privileged people have lifeguards.
Oh, wow. Meaning like a built-in safety net if the plunge goes wrong.
Exactly. Think about it. If a person with systemic privilege plunges into a conversation about race, makes a mess, uses the wrong terminology,
Sure.
or causes offense, well, there's a whole social infrastructure designed to rescue them.
Right. People will say, well, their heart was in the right place.
Yes. Or they are just learning, give them grace. Someone will pull them out of the deep end. But for marginalized individuals who don't have that privilege, plunging carries existential risk.
Ah, the stakes are totally asymmetrical.
Completely. If they speak out forcefully or make a misstep, they risk professional isolation, being labeled aggressive, losing their livelihood, or, even facing physical violence.
That fundamentally alters how you define bravery in these spaces, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it is objectively easier to be bold when you know a lifeguard is watching you.
Oh, absolutely.
And that asymmetrical risk leads right into another psychological roadblock the workshop identifies, which they call the pie myth.
Yes, the pie myth. This is huge.
It's this deeply ingrained, almost reflexive fear that extending equal rights and dignity to someone else means there will be fewer rights and less dignity left for you.
Which is really just a classic scarcity mindset applied to social economics. We are so conditioned by capitalism to view resources as finite.
Yeah.
If I have $10 and I give you 5, my wealth is diminished.
Right. I literally have less.
But the notes systematically dismantle applying that logic to civil rights. Dignity, opportunity, empathy, they are not a pie. There is not a fixed number of slices.
Yeah, when a marginalized group gains the right to vote or, access to better housing, the mechanical function of your right to vote hasn't been degraded. Your slice of the pie didn't shrink.
It actually works in reverse. The notes argue that dignity operates as a multiplier, not a divisible resource.
Oh, I like that. A multiplier.
Right? When you extend humanity and equity to a broader group of people, the overall stability, innovation, and health of the entire societal ecosystem improves. Enhancing the dignity of others inherently secures your own.
Okay, but, and this is the massive elephant in the room, if rights and dignity aren't a zero-sum game of pie, why does the conversation around racial privilege instantly trigger such intense defensiveness?
It really does.
I mean, the second the word privilege enters the airspace, walls go up, arms cross, and the conversation just grinds to a halt.
Well, it's because privilege is a heavily loaded semantic trigger.
Yeah.
When a lot of people, particularly working-class white people, when they hear the word privilege, they interpret it as a moral accusation.
Like they're being told their life was easy.
Exactly. They instantly scan their own lives. They remember the times they couldn't pay rent, the trauma they endured, the grueling jobs they worked, and they think, I haven't had an easy life. I am not privileged.
They conflate racial privilege with economic ease.
Precisely. And because of this psychological barrier, the notes point out that many organizations that are deeply committed to equity have actually started substituting the word privilege with the terms advantaged and disadvantaged.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on this a little
Yeah.
bit. Doesn't replacing the word privilege with advantaged completely cater to fragility? I mean, it feels like a corporate branding exercise to protect people from the uncomfortable reality of race. If we soften the language, aren't we just letting people off the hook?
That is the exact tension the workshop participants wrestled with, and it is a very valid critique.
Right, because you don't want to erase the race aspect.
No. And the notes are adamant that the goal is not to avoid naming race. Race has to be addressed as a distinct historical mechanism. Otherwise, people will just default to safer conversations about class or geography.
So why change the word?
Because the shift to advantaged is about understanding how human psychology works. If you use a word that causes someone's prefrontal cortex to immediately shut down in defense, the conversation is over.
You can't force awareness through a closed door.
Exactly. So it isn't about coddling them. It provides a clearer, less accusatory pathway into the conversation by acknowledging intersectionality. It allows a person to say, yes, I was severely disadvantaged economically and geographically, but I can recognize that I was advantaged racially. My race was not one of the factors making my life harder.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. You are trying to bypass the defensive reflex so they can actually stay in the room and do the work.
You have to meet people where they are to sustain engagement.
And speaking of the work, there is a concept in the notes that I found incredibly relieving. The workshop explicitly warns white people against trying to be the good white person or the woke white person.
Yes. It is a terrible trap, and honestly, it is driven by narcissism, not justice.
Right. It creates this arrogant, self-righteous binary where your primary motivation isn't to dismantle systemic harm, but to secure your own moral purity.
You just want to be seen as the good guy.
Exactly. You become terrified of making a mistake and being labeled bad, so you end up just paralyzed by guilt. And the notes are very clear on this. Guilt is a useless emotion in this context.
Coldly useless. Guilt is entirely focused on the self. It paralyzes action.
So the question becomes, what replaces the guilt?
Well, the notes advocate for adopting a strict orientation of humility. You acknowledge the historical, systemic benefits you have inherited, but you use that awareness to activate yourself.
And the specific mandate they use is striking. They argue you shouldn't strive to be an ally. You should strive to be a co-conspirator.
A co-conspirator. I love that phrasing.
It's a massive shift in mechanism, right? An ally often just offers performative sympathy. They will stand on the sidelines and cheer for you.
Yeah, post something on social media.
Right. A co-conspirator has skin in the game. They actively use their proximity to power to interrupt the system. They risk their own capital.
But to effectively disrupt that system, we have to understand how it was built in the first place.
Yes, and here's where it gets really interesting.
The notes detail a presentation from the workshop by Dr. Ali Michael, who explains that whiteness is not a biological or genetic truth. It is an inherited social construct.
It's a social construct.
This is the historical pivot that changes everything. Being dark or being light once meant absolutely nothing in terms of societal power or legal standing. The concept of whiteness was artificially engineered to consolidate power and protect property.
And it was legally codified.
Yes, exactly.
And when we say legally codified, we are talking about actual mechanics of the law, not just cultural attitudes. The sources outline a staggering Supreme Court case from 1923 that exposes exactly how arbitrary this construct is.
Oh, this case is mind-blowing.
It's the case of United States v. Bhagat Singh Thind. So Thind was an Indian immigrant who argued that, anthropologically, Indians were considered Caucasian, and therefore he should be classified as a free white person, eligible for naturalized citizenship.
Right, because at the time, citizenship was literally tied to being a free white person.
Yes. So the Supreme Court had to legally define what white meant.
And their ruling is just astonishing. They rejected the scientific anthropological definition.
They just threw it out.
Instead, the U.S. Supreme Court literally ruled that white is defined by the common understanding of the white man. To paraphrase the legal outcome, a person is white when any well-informed white person recognizes them as white.
Wow. It was literally an exclusive club drawing a circle around itself, fiercely guarding the gates of citizenship and property ownership.
And the boundaries of that circle moved whenever it was convenient for the people inside it.
Right. Because the definition of whiteness originally meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It deliberately excluded Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants.
But then, post-World War II, the mechanism shifted. As the country needed a larger unified middle class, the definition of whiteness expanded to include all those European immigrants.
But there was a catch.
A huge cost of admission. To gain access to the social and economic privileges of the White Club, these diverse immigrant groups were required to assimilate. They had to flatten their distinct cultural identities, abandon their native languages, and melt into the so-called melting pot.
And what did they melt into? They assimilated into that original Anglo-Saxon norm.
Exactly.
And the real-world impact of that assimilation is this invisible hum we live with today. The notes explain that whiteness became a very specific set of cultural practices. Restraint, emotional repression, specific modes of speech that were established as the universal norm for professionalism and good behavior.
Right.
So today, if you have a child in a classroom who comes from a culture that is naturally vibrant, boisterous, and expressive, they are immediately judged against this old, invisible standard.
Yes. They aren't misbehaving, they are just communicating differently. But the system penalizes them as disruptive. And this brings us to a quote from James Baldwin that's included in the text, and it perfectly crystallizes this dynamic. Being white means not having to think about it.
Not having to think about it.
Because the specific cultural norms of whiteness have been codified as the absolute default for what it means to be a human being in America. It is completely invisible to the people who possess it.
Just like the Midwestern accent we talked about at the beginning.
Exactly. This invisible default is embedded in our everyday vocabulary. I mean, think about the term non-white.
Oh, that phrase completely exposes the architecture of the system. Non-white. Imagine reversing that. Imagine treating another race as the universal baseline for humanity and categorizing white people as colorless.
It sounds absurd, Rodius.
It sounds totally absurd to our ears, but it proves exactly how deeply the default is wired into our reality. So how does this historical invention play out today, especially in terms of how we wire the brains of the next generation?
Well, the source material roots a huge portion of this analysis in our educational system.
And the data they provide is jarring.
Truly devastating. The notes highlight a statistic regarding media representation. 92% of traditionally published children's books feature a white protagonist.
Wait, 92%?
92%.
That is massive. And this isn't necessarily because of some conscious malicious conspiracy among publishers. It is the mechanism of the invisible default in action.
Publishers rely on what has traditionally sold, which just perpetuates the norm.
Right, but think about how that neurologically wires a child. It implicitly establishes, from the time they are toddlers, who gets to be the hero, who gets to have adventures, and who is the main character of reality.
So what does this all mean for us? According to Dr. Ali Michael's presentation, it means that educators, parents, and really anyone in a position of leadership must actively engage in their own racial identity work.
It's not optional.
No, she compares it directly to human development. Trying to teach or mentor a child without understanding your own racial identity and how that identity interacts with the system is professional malpractice.
Wow.
It is like trying to teach a middle schooler while refusing to acknowledge the existence of puberty. Race deeply informs who children think they are and who society tells them they're supposed to be.
But doing this kind of deep, systemic identity work in a school or a corporate environment, it inevitably triggers that defensiveness we talked about earlier. People resist.
Of course they do.
The notes offer a truly profound psychological tool for leaders facing that resistance, though. When you are trying to implement equity work and you hit a wall of pushback, you need to step back and ask yourself a pastoral question. What aren't they getting that they need?
It is a radical shift from judgment to empathy.
Yeah.
Psychological resistance rarely stems from pure malice. It usually stems from fear, a scarcity mindset, or just a deep feeling of being unseen.
Right.
The notes argue that when you do the hard work of making people feel truly seen, heard, and valued in their own struggles, their defensive posture relaxes. They no longer view inclusion as a threat. They actually begin to want for others the very dignity they just received themselves.
And to actively build that kind of trusting environment, the workshop notes lay out two very practical rules of engagement for any classroom or community.
These are great rules.
Yeah. First, they reference advice from civic leader Eric Liu. He says you must circulate your power. You cannot hoard authority.
Which is hard for a lot of leaders.
Oh, absolutely. In a classroom, that means decentralizing control. It means intentionally letting students lead discussions, shape the curriculum, and hold space, rather than the teacher just being the sole arbiter of truth.
And the second rule is essentially the golden standard for any environment where people are discussing identity. The rule is, the stories stay, the lessons leave.
I love that. The stories stay, the lessons leave, which creates a laboratory for vulnerability.
Right.
If I share a personal, messy story about my own biases, that story does not leave the room. It isn't used as gossip or leverage against me later.
Exactly.
But the structural lesson we learned from unpacking it, that leaves the room and changes the community. Without that confidentiality, the toe dippers we talked about earlier, they will never, ever get into the pool.
Never. So if we pull all these disparate threads together, the asymmetrical risk of plunging, the invention of the white default, the psychological need to be seen, we arrive at the core, unavoidable insight of Novick's notes. Racism is not merely a collection of prejudiced individuals doing bad things. It is a massive, historic, self-sustaining system. And the chilling reality is that you do not get to opt out.
No, simply by going about your day and playing by the established rules of society, you are passively upholding and protecting an unjust system. The system actually relies on your passive compliance.
Which means neutrality is a myth.
Yeah.
You have to actively choose to break the rules. You have to disrupt the default. And the ultimate takeaway from the notes is that dismantling this system does not just elevate marginalized groups, it liberates everyone.
Yeah, the text poses a fascinating hypothetical that really exposes the grand illusion of racial division.
Oh, the solidarity hypothetical.
Right. What would happen if working-class white people realized that their economic struggles, their lack of health care, and their crumbling infrastructure gave them vastly more in common with working-class black people than they could ever have with wealthy white people.
It would completely upend the power structure of the country.
Completely. The notes point out that this realization would fundamentally alter the politics of housing, education, and wealth distribution. The system of racial bias isn't just harming minorities, it is a tool used to fracture solidarity and hold everyone back.
Liberation work, when done with humility and courage, liberates everyone. It is fundamentally about the pursuit of wholeness.
It is about choosing to hear the hum of the system rather than ignoring it just because you aren't the one currently freezing inside the machine.
Beautifully said.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as you step back into your day.
Okay.
If the historical construct of whiteness relies entirely on being the invisible default against which all other human behavior is judged, well, what would your life look like tomorrow if you started actively noticing your own cultural norms? If you stopped treating your specific way of communicating, your way of expressing emotion, or your standard for professionalism as just normal, how might that fundamentally change the way you judge the people around you?